So I'm really excited about this next segment. We've asked John Pryor to come back, and after having briefed us this methodology, which we call winning choices, as a way to help clients develop capture strategies and win strategies. We asked John to brief the audience here on another methodology which we've pioneered, which is called Prospective Lessons Learned. And this is actually very useful, perhaps left of kind of when companies start thinking about a particular win strategy. It's really about how we can help companies shape the acquisitions themselves. So I'll hand it over to John.
Great, thanks, AJ. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be back. Okay, so as AJ said, today we're going to be talking about prospective lessons learned. So what is prospective lessons learned? So really, this is this idea that a lot of times when companies lose these competitions, they've lost long before the actual draft RFP has come out. They've either have missed something in terms of what the competition is going to do, what the customer is going to do, a change in how the customer might think about what they actually want at the end of it. They might have, as it says there, an inherent selective bias, so they believe their technology or their approach is unassailable. But oftentimes these get found out later in the game when people go back and do a lessons learned. And so probably everyone on this call has participated in some sort of lessons learned activity. And a lot of times when you do those types of activities, everybody all of a sudden says, "Oh, well, we should have seen that coming, or we knew that was going to happen, or why didn't we do something about that?" So that was really what drove the idea of thinking about prospective lessons learned. So what is it? So at its core, it says there are different ways that an acquisition might go, that a competition might follow. And this can be applied in other ways, but it's primarily designed for major acquisitions and major competitions. So those kinds of things that are multi-month, multi-year activities that have long capture cycles in them. So the goal of it is to be able to identify where these different places, the zigs and the zags, might actually occur, and then figure out what, if any, leverage you have on those paths. What steps you would need to take to be able to move it towards a preferred acquisition, what steps you would need to take if it doesn't go to a preferred acquisition. And so there's a whole bunch of other activities that Jock and AJ participate with the management consulting team, things around optionality, developing alternative approaches, essentially new teaming strategies, all kinds of additional products that we do with this. But that's the idea around this. And so really it happens when as on the right hand side, as we talked about briefly last week, why would you even do this at all? So it's this idea where there's essentially uncertainty, which is where the optionality comes in. So if it's not clear where the customer wants to go, that end user, it may not even be from an opaque standpoint. They may just genuinely not know where they want to go and have a lot of different options. It shows up whenever competitors have significantly different approaches to how to solve the problem. So it's an intelligence problem. Somebody's going to put up an airplane, and somebody else is going to put up a satellite, and somebody else is going to put up some sort of ground system delivered by special forces. That's an absurd example. But it's the intent that there's really not a way to compare apples and oranges, or excuse me, apples and apples, because it's an apple and orange and a Chevrolet. So that you're trying to figure out. And then the last one is really this idea of an existential threat. And so the term must win gets overused a lot. Everyone uses it on every competition, but there are these times where there's these existential threats. So if you lose the competition, you're out of a specific line of business. Is a good example of that. And so in those cases, it's worth it to take the extra time to look at it. So this is what it looks like. 7-step process, similar to what we talked about last time with making winning choices. It starts with identifying here on these key uncertainties. So what is really at play? Then you move to actually mapping the various outcomes. So what are the various solutions that might be out there? You start to map on number 3, what's the acquisition strategies that might be available to the customer. This can include different contracting approaches. This can include different approaches on teaming strategy, on how their government furnished equipment, how they're going to deploy in a lot of different ways, split into different programs so that there might be multiple programs. Then you identify what is your preferred, but also what is your customer's preferred approach and your competitor's preferred approach. So you try to identify where everybody wants to be. What are the leverage points that are going to get you along, the solution C where you want to be? And then what are your contingency plans if you end up on some of these other paths? It's insufficient to just say, well, that's too bad, we lost it at 0.5. I guess we should hang it up. Insufficient to do that. So you have to be prepared to deal with that. Why did we even do PL2? So just a slight bit of history. So we did PL2 because we had done back a million years ago, AJ, John Montgomery, Monty, for those of you who know him, Ted Kasner, me, Rafael Suarez, and others had done a lessons learned activity for Northrop Grumman after they had lost the protest to Boeing on the KCX program. And so, as many of you probably know, objectively, and recognizing that it was our customer, the offering from Northrop and Airbus was superior. It was in many ways, but Boeing burned everything to the ground, including their customer, to make sure that they won the protest and to not lose that franchise that they had. They had spent decades acquiring companies, building aircraft, and creating an aerial refueling franchise, and they just weren't willing to lose it. And so even though Northrop had come up with a better mousetrap, substantially so, that just wasn't going to fly with Boeing. So in many respects, we built exactly what I just showed you was the story. And so the words on here don't matter. The detail here doesn't matter. But essentially, that was these ideas of at these different points. There could have been a single approach, one aircraft. There could have been multiple aircraft. There were these different points where there were insertion points, and that Northrop Grumman might have done something, or Boeing could have done something differently. And we've mapped basically a tree, exactly as you saw, this idea of how it might play out. We created to back that up this idea of the scenarios. Where were these? What were they going to be able to do next going forward? Because now we were already starting to develop a prototype version of prospective lessons learned. So could you actually do a true recompete? Was there going to be a rapid recompete? This idea of how the government might actually recompete this, because now Northrop was having to decide, are they going to invest the money to go back into this? Because it was a substantial lift on their part. As it turns out, they did not, although Airbus did end up competing. And so then we scored it. So who was going to be on board? And so Air Force, OSD, all were involved, but also Congress on how they were thinking about it. And so this idea that we kind of reached was, it was going to be unlikely that there was a Northrop win, where there was no way that Northrop was going. There was a limited opportunity that Northrop was going to win, given the political circumstances. As I said yesterday's on the original slides, it was today's, but probably today it's the same kind of problem. So we had told them, like, look, this is where you are at the end of the day. You have to write another proposal that's a winning proposal while your primary competitor knows your pricing. That's problematic. And then you have these other types of conditions. And so ultimately, as I said, they decided not to bid again based off of that. AJ, let me pause there. Did you anything you wanted to add about the KCX, or do you want to wait until later? That competition.
Yeah, I think we can wait till a bit later, but I do want to point out that this was actually a very significant piece of effort. It was about a 6-month project we did directly for the CEO of Northrop Grumman, and it actually led. It's one of those cases where it actually helped them inform a decision that they ended up making to actually. And I'm not going to ruin your punchline here, John, on this, but it was a really interesting piece of work from that work actually led to the development of this methodology that John is describing.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about it now. How do we use it now? So as I've discussed last week, and as we've said on here, there's not we don't use it often. It's under very specific circumstances, and so but this is how we've used it in the future. So the most recent, a recent example of us using it was on the FFGX competition. So now the Constellation class frigate. And so that really started with these ideas of scenarios. So as many of you know, there were a lot more slides to back all this up, but the detail. But as many of you know, the Constellation class was designed to replace the Oliver Perry class ship. There were lots of different acquisition strategies that could go, and that was partially what we ended up doing. This idea of creating a storyline that said, okay, well, what are the different scenarios that are out there? And so this here is business as usual. So it's the F-35 model. You're going to end up with a high cost but exceptionally capable platform. This is where people love to go, the conspiracy of hope. So it's going to be super cheap, but it's going to have amazing capability, and just build enough of them with a learning curve, and everything's going to work out well. This one up here was where LCS actually is, super high cost and low capability. So the worst of all worlds. And then the workhorse here, in many respects, was actually where the Oliver Perry was, reasonably priced, not super capable, but able to get done what it needed to do. And so that started to lay out what were all of the choices that they had. So the actual redoing of the cruisers ended up having it was expensive. You could use destroyers. You could come up with this new FFGX. You could do LCS again, which had already been tried multiple times. But there were all these different approaches, and so that was the first key, was kind of really understanding where the customer could go. So at the heart of this slide is the heart of the work that we actually did. So we said, okay, recognizing that the customer has all of these different paths that they can do, how exactly are they going to fill this mission? And that's ultimately what we did, was we created these different nodes. What are all the things that the Navy is saying they really want to do when you kind of distill down multiple documents, congressional presentations, presidential guidance, all the things that are coming down? How exactly are they going to fill this mission and capability gap? Now, the grayed out part that we ended up not looking at for the specific workshop that we did, but that we had looked at for the customer separately from this, could have been business as usual. I mean, in the sense that they could delay the acquisition, they could use alternative approaches, they could cancel the acquisition because it was already in play. So there certainly are other ways that they could have solved this problem without even doing anything with what is now Constellation. But we made an assumption that the Navy was going to go forward because they were adamant that they were going to go forward. So then the question became, how capable do you actually want to be? And then you ended up with two things. Do you get an LCS plus, so a better mousetrap on the LCS, or do you end up with a destroyer minus? If you end up with an LCS plus, there were a couple of different classes of ships that could have been in there, and that would have been your competitive set. If you ended up with a destroyer minus, you ended up with another set of people, and you can see that it was, there really wasn't a lot of overlap. And then ultimately, it was this idea of how do you pick the FREM, which was Fincantieri's option. And so that's what happens then at each step. And I'll go on to how we did the first step. But when you look at this here at step one, all the competitors are on the same team. Every single one of them wants the FFGX competition to go forward. So you're not actually battling them, even as you're already battling them. Once you got to node 2, there was another group of people that were on your team that you were trying to work with BAE. You were trying to think about Nancia and how you were going to work with those guys. And so it was about moving that forward. It wasn't until you got to the end here that the other European players, you needed to distinguish yourself from them, is where we're at. So what do you do at each of these nodes? So at each of these nodes, and this is the connection back to making winning choices, you do this. So as you may recall from making winning choices, you do a reverse engineering. What has to be true for the Navy to continue to pursue and fill its mission capability gap? And there's all kinds of things. Fincantieri had to do stuff. The competitors, end users, and operators had to do stuff. Acquisition community, Navy leadership, and Congress. And so we mapped all of this exactly like this. And so we were using at the time a slightly different making winning choices model that we actually still use this one as well. It depends on the project that we're doing, whether we'll use the other one that you saw last week. So there ended up being these 4 at that particular node that were problematic. 2 of them were very low control. 1 of them had high control. 1 of them was low-ish. And so that then became the cluster to look at. So where are you going to be able to deliver your activities. And so ultimately, these three here were the ones that were there. So LCS, there's no control on whether LCS is going to be able to continue to fail at its mission. Maybe LCS gets a lot better. Maybe Austal and those guys get better at developing this capability. And then all of a sudden, the Navy says they don't need a new ship. The Alabama delegation was another particular group at play. You don't have any ability to influence them, or limited ability, particularly since your shipyards aren't there. So you can offset them indirectly through your delegations, but how much do those guys get serious about keeping LCS in the game? Because they've been quite brilliant at it on keeping this ship going. And then this last piece was how do you compete? How do you get a program champion at sufficient level? And so there is some ability for you to do that. But this here is what you then would create the action plans around. And that's, as we talked about before, that's how you create these types of action plans. And so in this case, this is the one you saw last week. We did not create an action plan in this format, which is why it's not here. We ended up writing, I think it was an 8 or 10 page memo to them, which detailed out everything that we thought they needed to do for their high risk conditions. And again, remember, we did these high risk conditions at multiple nodes. So we ended up doing that reverse engineering exercise. It was a pretty intense day because we were doing them in an hour and a half, and really just banging them out, and then doing the analysis later in terms of the detailed action planning. So that's it. That's the heart of it. So PL2 is just this idea to help understand and drive that uncertainty. To be able to position yourself to have the right conversations, create the right positioning, so that if a competition isn't going your way, you're able to move it your way. It's meant to drive those capture activities and to set the agenda for you as you move forward, as well as all of your contingency planning. So let me pause there, and Jock and AJ.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, John. So just a couple of comments to get a conversation started here, but can you go back to the slide that showed the 4 scenarios or options for Northrop Grumman on tanker?
I certainly can.
Yeah. That'd be great. And I'm sorry, I thought you were going to give the punchline, so I'll give the punchline for everybody. Go.
Sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Tanker was a super interesting program because it was actually one of those rare occasions. It doesn't happen as often as it used to, where in fact the Air Force had a decision to make between 2 very different offerings, the Airbus offering or the Boeing offering, and there were 2 very different types of airplanes. Keep on going to the right. Just the 4. One more to the right. There we go. Those 4. So this is one of those cases where, as a consultant, you don't always, the client doesn't always either express to you everything that they've used to inform their decisions with, or doesn't always take the decision or recommendation that you give. But this was a case where, in fact, Northrop Grumman did go with the recommendation we made, which was essentially, at this point, we felt that the competition was lost way back when. And I'll point out kind of when it was lost for them, even though they won on the first award. But they did take our advice and decided not to bid it as a prime on the second go around. In this case, Airbus was actually the prime on the second go around, and so it was gratifying for the team that worked on this project. They realized that, in fact, at this point, it was totally existential to Boeing, and they would do whatever it would take to ultimately become the victor of the tanker program. Can we go back a couple slides now? This was done in about the 2010 time frame right here. So where it was really kind of lost, it was fairly early in the RFP process before the final RFP came out. And what Northrop Grumman had not fully understood or realized at the time was that they could have actually pushed the Section M, which is the evaluation factors for the offers in the RFP, a lot harder to fully give Northrop Grumman's solution credit for the fact that it had longer range and larger fuel capacity than the Boeing solution did. And they went so far, but then realized they actually could have taken it farther. So those 2 key advantages of the Airbus offering actually were not formally scoreable, believe it or not. There were also a number of other elements in Section M that they could have pushed harder on to ensure that, in fact, their offer was the advantages of their offer was going to actually be a part of the formal evaluation.
Yeah, as I recall, they also had things around cargo, being able to convert it to a cargo
Mhm.
aircraft that were not scoreable as well. I mean, it was quite extraordinary how capable.
Yeah.
And as those of you who know me, I often tell the engineers, you get 30 seconds to tell me about your product, because whatever you produce, your competitors can produce something that is equally amazing. But in this case, it was one of the few opportunities that we've worked on that there really was a substantial difference in capability.
You're right. And it was a very it's one of those cases or engagements where there's a lot of sensitivity to it, because they were, the chief executive officer, Ron Sugar of Northrop Grumman, was personally involved in it, as well as his top leadership team, including Wes Bush and others. And so it's one of those cases where you had to tread a little bit lightly, and when you delivered the news, had to deliver it quite carefully.
I think it's interesting. These, a lot of these acquisitions, we get in our minds that it's about what we write, or the approach that we take on how we're going to win, and we're thinking about our competitors in the same way. But oftentimes this solution helps us also identify the competitor as looking at protecting a different franchise and avoiding this pursuit from cannibalizing a franchise they may own. So their objective isn't to win; their objective may be to kill the acquisition,
Yeah.
or to move it into something else.
Yeah.
AJ, it's interesting when as we've developed this solution, it's always occurred to me that had we run this on MQ-25, or what was originally U-class, I think we would have been able to inform our client in a very different way about their acquisition, and how they needed to think about their strategy, and how they needed to think about shaping, which we didn't do that for this, but we were able to do that, as John mentioned in his presentation for FinCantier on FFGX, and I think that definitely helped move the needle in the right direction for them as a result of providing this prospective lessons learned on that acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think FP25 was a really good example that I thank you for bringing that up, because unfortunately we didn't have the opportunity to do it for our client on MQ25, but
Right.
That was an acquisition that had a lot of uncertainty to it. It ranged from the MQ25 being something that could actually go into contested airspace, deep penetrating contested airspace, to something that was uncontested and more surveillance and networked with other aircraft, to what it finally became was a unmanned aerial refueler. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of opportunity, and every company that was involved was trying to shape that acquisition strategy, obviously, to an advantage in terms of what they had worked on previously.
And I think Lockheed was the winner in all of this, as they were trying to avoid something cannibalizing the mission statement of the F-35.
Right.
So they moved it to another market segment.
Yeah, and Thayer, thank you for making that comment. And truth be told, a lot of companies do actually actively have campaigns to try to kill new programs, because they want to obviously preserve the franchise they have in their heritage. And so I do want to point out that there's a historical context actually here for SMA on this, and how we actually think about both this methodology as well as the methodology John presented last week, the winning choices. So if you think about SMA's history as being, largely comprised out of, basically taking a lot of years of experience of reducing the proposal process itself to a really, solid, robust process. And that is just not process, but also leadership and how we think about the trade craft and creating winning proposals. So it basically reduced it to something that was predictable, and something that we could train people in, and something where the outcomes were predictable based on certain indicators during the process. What we did with winning choices in the methodology was that we tried to take the same level of robust methodology, made it analytic and data-based, to how companies should think about win strategy. And this actually even pushes it more to the left in terms of how to think about a robust methodology of thinking about capture strategy, when you really need to, capture strategy is kind of that phase where you have the opportunity to shape the acquisition itself more so. And so I think, historically, this is something which I was very excited about us being able to do and offer to our clients, where that same level of robust methodology that we over the years have applied to the proposal process itself, we're actually moving it to the left, where companies still do it in a very much of an ad hoc manner, both the creation of the win strategy as well as how to think about capture strategy.
Right. In fact, we're running pursuit right now, that we got to at the point of, where the capture had been done and we started helping develop the proposal. We did a little bit of price to win work on it, but it's in the IT sector. And I really think that although we talk about this solution as really being for more MDAP programs, I think on that it would have been wildly helpful to a client there as well, because there are a variety of choices and there's a variety of strategies that could be run. And I think there's a number of things that could have been done to shape the acquisition had they had the insights that come from a solution like this.
Yeah, agree.
Go ahead,
Go ahead, John.
I was just going to say I agreed on that, Jock, and as Jock knows, and as many of the sales team on the call, we've been working to try to create a shorter version of this at a more cost-effective, better price point for exactly that reason. So there are other opportunities that this is applicable for that may not have the BMP to support a substantial full engagement, but could definitely benefit from it. So I agree, Jock.
Yeah, a fast cycle.
Yeah, fast cycle ones. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's for those of you who are actually running capture out there. I would suggest that you take the time to get a little better insights into this, because this is something that moves the needle for the client. And there's a lot. Acquisitions are getting more complex. There's a lot more nuanced strategy that's happening, and a lot more influencing of customers that are driving outcomes very early. As AJ said, a lot of these acquisitions aren't lost during the RFP. They're lost during the strategy development, and people get married to strategy. I always equate that to writing code. Once you've written it, you feel like you got to fix it to make it work, as opposed to rethinking it and developing something that's better. And I think strategy, is the same thing. It's complex. People invest a lot of time in it, and if it's wrong, it can cost you the acquisition long before you ever get to the point of bursting the RFP.
Indeed. And it's kind of funny how this whole thing arose. So the whole methodology was created actually after having done a lessons learned activity for our client. And then we started to noodle on it and think, well, what if you could actually learn some of those lessons in advance, right? And part of that is, I think, John, where you started out was from a lot of these acquisitions, when you do lose, when a client loses, there's usually an epiphany as to, oh yeah, that's why we lost, right? It comes down to usually to a single statement, and it's trying to kind of uncover that in advance, and so that you can prevent that from occurring. Yeah. Well, thank you, John. That was excellent. We will make these slides available on our learning management system. And then also, for any of you who are proposal managers, capture managers, or just interested in this, please reach out, and we're happy to spend time with you in terms of understanding this methodology and how to use it.
Absolutely.